The ship came down in the middle of a cornfield in rural Kansas, and nobody believed Marcus Webb when he called it in. The sheriff's department sent one deputy, and that deputy drove away without getting out of his car. So Marcus stood there alone in the flattened corn, staring at something that looked like a piece of the night sky had fallen and decided to stay. It was not silver. It was not saucer-shaped. It was roughly the size of a school bus, and it looked like it had grown rather than been built, all curved edges and surfaces that seemed to breathe in the moonlight. He should have run. Every instinct he had, every action movie he had ever watched, every warning his dead mother had ever given him about things that were none of his business, told him to run. Marcus Webb was 43 years old, recently divorced, farming land that had been in his family for 4 generations, and he had a bad knee from an old football injury that had never healed right. He did not run. He walked toward it. That was the first mistake. Or maybe it was not a mistake at all. That was something he would think about for a long time afterward. The door, if you could call it that, opened before he reached it. Light came out, but not like normal light. It did not illuminate things so much as it revealed them, like the difference between a lamp and an X-ray. Marcus stopped walking. 3 figures stood in the opening. They were tall, maybe 7 feet, and thin in a way that made him think of reeds growing at the edge of a pond. Their skin, if it was skin, was a pale gray-blue that shifted slightly when they moved. They had 2 eyes each, very large, very dark, positioned wider on the face than human eyes. They had no visible mouths. Their hands, if those were hands, had too many fingers. One of them pointed something at him. He felt a pressure behind his eyes, and then, very suddenly, he could understand them. Not their words. They did not seem to use words the way humans did. He could understand their intent, their meaning, the shape of their communication. It arrived in his mind like a translation that had been done by someone who understood the language, but not the culture, technically correct, but slightly off. They told him they were researchers. They told him they had been watching his planet for a long time, which he found both flattering and deeply unsettling. They told him they were particularly interested in him, which was even more unsettling. They had been observing him for 3 years. They knew about his divorce. They knew about his knee. They knew about the accident that had killed his younger brother Daniel 12 years ago, the one Marcus had been driving for, the one that was not technically his fault, but that he had never stopped carrying anyway. They wanted to study his pain. He stood in the cornfield for a long time after they said that. The moon was almost full. Somewhere in the distance a dog was barking at something that probably was not as alarming as this. Marcus thought about Daniel, about the way the light had looked on the highway that night, about the sound of metal. He thought about his ex-wife Claire, and how she had not left because she stopped loving him, but because loving him had become something she could no longer afford to do. He thought about his knee, which ached every single morning when he got out of bed, a reminder that some things break and do not fully heal. He said yes. They were surprised. He could feel that. Whatever emotional equivalent they had for surprise moved through the communication like a ripple, slight but unmistakable. They had expected negotiation. They had expected fear or refusal or demands for proof of their intentions. They had prepared for all of those scenarios. They had not prepared for a tired farmer in a flannel shirt to simply say yes before they had even finished explaining. He followed them onto the ship. The inside was nothing like the outside. It was larger, for one thing, in a way that should not have been geometrically possible. The surfaces were covered in what looked like living diagrams, lines and shapes that moved slowly and responded to presence the way water responds to being touched. There were other beings on the ship, 6 more that he could see, and they all stopped what they were doing and looked at him with those wide, dark eyes. He was not afraid. He understood later that he probably should have been, that a reasonable person would have been terrified, but Marcus had used up most of his fear years ago. There was a particular kind of numbness that came from carrying grief long enough, and it had the unexpected side effect of making extraordinary things feel almost manageable. They showed him to a room. It was smooth and warm, and smelled faintly of something he could not name, clean in the way deep forest air is clean. There was something like a chair, shaped for a body that was not quite his, but close enough. They asked him to sit, and then the lead researcher, the one who had pointed the translation device at him, sat across from him with a collection of instruments that looked organic, like bones or shells or coral, and began. They asked about the accident first. He told them. He told them everything, the way you tell a story when you have told it so many times in your own head that the words come out smooth and worn like stones in a river. He told them about the rain on the road, and Daniel's laugh from the passenger seat, and the headlights of the truck coming the wrong direction, and the sound, that sound, and then the silence after. He told them what silence sounds like when it means something terrible. He told them about the years after, about how grief was not a wound that healed, but a shape you learned to live inside. The researcher's instruments moved constantly, recording things Marcus could not see. But about halfway through, something changed. The researcher stopped moving its instruments. It went very still. The others in the room, who had been pretending to do other things while obviously listening, also went still. Marcus paused. He asked, through the translation, if everything was all right. The researcher did not answer right away. When it did, the communication that arrived in Marcus's mind was different from before. Less clinical. Something had shifted in the texture of it, the same way a voice changes when the person speaking has been unexpectedly moved. It said that it had been studying pain for a long time. It said it had studied many species on many worlds. It said it had collected enormous amounts of data on suffering, on loss, on grief, on the long aftermath of terrible moments. It said that it had always understood pain as a biological signal, a warning system, a product of neurological and chemical processes. It said that it had not understood, until this moment, that pain could also be a form of love. Marcus looked at it for a long time. Outside, the Kansas night was going on without him, crickets and wind, and the ordinary darkness of an ordinary world. He was sitting inside a ship built by beings who had crossed distances he could not begin to imagine, and one of them had just said the most accurate thing anyone had ever said about his brother. He did not cry. He had not cried about Daniel in years, not because he had healed, but because he had run dry. But something in his chest moved, slow and heavy, like ice beginning, very slightly, to thaw. He said, "Yes, that is exactly right. Pain, when it comes from love, is the proof that the love was real. You cannot have one without leaving room for the other." The researcher was silent for a long moment. Then it made a sound. Not through the translation device, not through any instrument Marcus could identify. It made a sound with whatever it used for a voice, low and resonant, and the other researchers in the room made the same sound in response, like an echo or an agreement. Marcus did not know it yet, but that sound was the first time any of them had ever made it. It was the sound of grief. It had been newly understood. The researcher's name, as close as Marcus could translate it, was something like Vessel of Long Light, which he shortened to Vel because he was a Kansas farmer and not a poet. Vel did not seem to mind. Over the following days, Marcus came to understand that the beings on the ship did not attach the kind of importance to names that humans did. Names were functional to them, descriptive rather than personal. The fact that a human would shorten a name to something warmer and easier struck Vel as interesting. The way a child finding a new way to use a tool strikes an engineer as interesting. They spent those first days in careful, methodical work. Vel and the team asked questions, measured responses, mapped what they called the architecture of Marcus's suffering. They were thorough in the way only beings with a truly scientific mind can be thorough, missing nothing, leaving no thread unpulled. Marcus answered everything honestly. He had decided on the first night that if he was going to do this, he was going to do it properly, and holding things back seemed like a waste of everyone's time. They asked about Claire. He told them about 17 years of marriage and what it feels like to watch someone you love slowly decide that you are too much of a weight to keep carrying. He was careful to say that she was not cruel. She was not a villain in his story. She was simply a person who had a limited amount of herself to give, and he had needed more than his share for too long. The loneliness of the divorce, he explained, was not the loneliness of being without her. It was the loneliness of having been a burden and knowing it. It was the specific grief of understanding that the person who loved you the most still could not carry what you had become. Vel recorded this with the bone and shell instruments. But then, again, went still. The rest of the team was paying full attention now, not even pretending to do other things. 6 pairs of wide dark eyes were fixed on Marcus in a way that he found not threatening, but strange. As though he were doing something they had not anticipated and could not quite categorize. Marcus asked what they were writing down. Vel said they were not writing anything anymore. They had stopped recording several minutes ago. They were simply listening. That was the second shift. Marcus felt it as clearly as the first, the way a room changes when the purpose of the people in it changes. They had come in as scientists and were sitting now as something else, something that did not have a clean professional label. He asked Vel whether their species experienced loneliness. Vel considered the question for a long time before answering. The answer that arrived was careful, layered. Their species had separation responses. They had states of reduced function that occurred when isolated from their group. These states were understood as biological conditions, managed with techniques and corrective measures, treated the way humans might treat low blood sugar. The idea that loneliness might be an emotional experience with weight and meaning, that it might say something about the depth of a connection rather than simply signal a need to restore equilibrium, had not been part of their framework. Marcus told them about the first winter after Claire left. He told them about the particular cruelty of a farmhouse that was built for more than one person, now occupied by only one. He told them about cooking meals and not bothering to use a proper plate. He told them about the way silence in a house where there used to be another person's sounds is a different kind of silence from ordinary quiet. It has a shape. It has a before and an after. You can feel the space where something was. One of the other researchers, a smaller one that Marcus had privately named Reed, set down its instrument entirely and did not pick it up again. He noticed this and said nothing about it. Vel asked about the knee. This felt like a deliberate shift to safer territory, and Marcus understood the impulse. He had done the same thing himself many times, changing the subject when a conversation got too close to something real. He talked about the knee. He explained the injury, the surgery, the physical therapy, the point at which his doctor had said there was nothing more to be done, and Marcus had understood that some things simply became part of you whether you wanted them to or not. He explained the way the knee spoke to him every morning, a reliable ache that was almost like company, proof that the past was real and permanent. Vel asked whether the physical pain was the worst of it. Marcus almost laughed. He told them no. He told them that the worst was not the ache itself, but the memory attached to it. The knee was the game where he had first been hurt. The Friday night in November, the last game of his senior season, his mother in the stands in her red coat, alive and proud and completely unaware that her younger son would be dead in 20 years, and her older son would spend the rest of his life driving that fact around like cargo he could not put down. The knee was a door to everything. Every time it hurt, he did not just feel the knee. He felt the whole chain. The room was fully quiet now. Not the efficient, working quiet of a research team. The quiet of people listening to something that had gotten inside them. Reed made a sound. Low, small, almost inaudible. The same kind of sound Vel had made on the first night. Marcus looked at Reed. Reed seemed startled by its own reaction. The way a person is startled when they cry at a film they were expecting to find merely entertaining. Vel spoke quietly, too. Reed in their own communication. Too fast and layered for Marcus's translation to catch all of it. But the shape of it felt like reassurance. It felt like one person saying to another, I know. I felt it too. Marcus watched this and felt something he had not expected to feel in this situation. He felt tender toward them. He was a man who had spent years being studied by grief, mapped and catalogued by loss. And now he was watching grief begin to study beings who had never expected to encounter it personally. There was something almost gentle about it. They were not afraid, exactly. They were disoriented, the way you are disoriented when something you believed was a purely intellectual concept suddenly becomes an experience. You are living from the inside. He asked Vel, carefully, whether they were all right. The answer came back uncertain. Not in a distressed way, but in the way of someone standing in unfamiliar territory and not yet sure whether it is dangerous or simply new. Vel said something that translated, approximately, as, we are experiencing something for which our instruments have no category. Marcus nodded. He said he understood. He said that was what grief felt like from the inside, too. You could describe it, study it, measure it, map its landscape in detail, and it still arrived like a country you had never visited. Foreign and enormous, and somehow larger than you had imagined, even after all your preparation. He told them that this was, in his experience, the only real limit of science. Science could tell you everything about rain, the evaporation cycles, the cloud formation, the temperature of precipitation, the chemical composition of a single drop. But the first time you stood in the rain after someone you loved had died, it was still just you and the rain, and no data in the world covered the distance. Vel did not respond immediately. When the response came, it was quiet and without its usual clinical structure. It said simply, we did not know there was a distance. Marcus stayed with that for a moment. Then he said gently that there was always a distance, and that the distance was not a failure. The distance was the shape of how much something mattered. That night, for the first time since Marcus had come aboard, the research team did not file reports. He could tell. The rhythm of the ship changed. The quiet hum of data being processed and recorded fell away, and what replaced it was a different kind of silence. The kind he knew from his own farmhouse, on the nights when he sat on the porch and looked at the dark fields and thought about Daniel. And the thinking itself was all he had to give, and also all he needed to do. He sat in his room and listened to the ship breathe, and thought about how strange it was that a human being's grief could travel this far and still be the most ordinary thing in any room it entered. It was the most human thing about him, this carrying, and it had crossed the distance between worlds and landed here, among beings who had never expected to feel it, and now they were feeling it. And there was nothing any of their instruments could do about that dot in the long darkness of deep space. Reed sat alone with its instrument on its lap and did not record a single thing. On the 8th day, Vel asked Marcus something that no one had asked him in years. Not a research question, not a clinical inquiry designed to extract data and file it in a category. Vel asked Marcus how he kept going. It was early in what the ship systems designated as morning, which Marcus had begun to observe as a kind of routine, because routines were how he had survived the last 12 years. He was sitting with something warm that was not quite coffee, but performed the same function. And Vel came and sat across from him without instruments, without the bone and shell recording tools, without the layered professional distance of a scientist meeting a subject. Marcus looked at Vel for a moment. The wide, dark eyes were watching him with something new in them, something that had not been there on the first night. They had been curious then, sharply, deficiently curious. What they held now was different, quieter. The way a question changes when the person asking it genuinely needs the answer. He thought about the question, honestly before answering, because it deserved that. He said that he did not always keep going well. There were mornings when getting out of bed was a negotiation. There were winters when the farm felt less like home and more like a sentence. But he kept going because the alternative was a kind of betrayal he could not commit, not to himself, but to everyone he had loved. Daniel had not chosen to stop. His mother had not chosen to stop. They had been taken. To stop voluntarily felt like an insult to the involuntary nature of their endings. Vel processed this for a long time. Then it said that their species did not have the concept of choosing to continue. It was not something their psychology contained, because the idea of choosing to stop, absent a terminal biological condition, had never been part of their experience. Their drive to continue was automatic, biological, unexamined. The idea that a being might have to make an active choice to keep living, might have to construct reasons and stack them carefully like stones in a wall, and then maintain the wall daily, was something entirely outside their model of consciousness. Marcus told Vel that this was the thing humans almost never talked about honestly, the maintenance. Everyone talked about healing, about recovery, about moving forward. Nobody talked about the daily labor of simply staying. It was not dramatic work. It did not look like anything from the outside. It was just waking up and deciding again, and then doing that tomorrow and the day after, without any guarantee that it would ever feel easier, and mostly just trusting that the people who said it did get easier had not been lying. He asked Vel what had prompted the question. Not a challenge, just curiosity. Vel was quiet for a moment. Then it said that 3 of the research team had spent the previous night in a state their species called unanchored. The closest translation Marcus's mind could produce was unmoored, adrift, the feeling of reaching for a familiar support and finding it gone. They had experienced it before, only in cases of biological crisis or severe separation from the group. What was new was that they had experienced it last night, while physically present with their group, fully safe, fully connected. The content of Marcus's sessions had moved into them in a way that had not resolved when the sessions ended. They were carrying it. Marcus sat with his not-quite-coffee and felt the weight of that. He asked whether this had alarmed them. Vel said that alarmed was not quite right. They were not in distress, or not only in distress. Several of them had described the state as also being illuminating, as if something they had always known the outline of had gained depth and interior, like the difference between a diagram of a room and standing inside it. They understood things now about pain and connection and loss that their entire field of research had not provided, and they understood them not as data, but as something more personal. The difference was significant. Marcus asked Vel directly whether Vel was experiencing it too. The answer came slowly, with a care that suggested Vel was being precise about something it had not had language for before last night. It said yes. It said that it had spent a very long night thinking about a colleague it had worked with for many years who had died during a research mission 7 of their years ago. It said that it had processed that event at time using all the appropriate biological and psychological protocols. It had reached functional equilibrium relatively quickly and had not thought of the colleague with any particular frequency since. Last night, for the first time, it had thought about the colleague not as a fact or a memory to be filed, but as an absence, as a space that still had a shape. And the shape had mattered. Marcus put down the cup. He said quietly, "I am sorry about your colleague." Vel looked at him. The wide dark eyes were very still. The communication that came back was simple and unsteady in a way none of the previous communications had been. It said thank you. Just that. Not a data point, not a response designed to move the session forward. Just thank you, the way a person says it when they mean it and have needed to hear the thing being acknowledged for longer than they realized. Marcus nodded. He said that was grief. That was exactly what it was. Not the event, not the moment of loss, but the afterward. The finding of the shape. The recognition that something real was missing. By midday, the research sessions had changed completely. Marcus and Vel still met and still talked, but the structure was gone. The instruments remained on the table, and nobody picked them up. The other team members came and went, sometimes sitting quietly in the room, sometimes asking questions of their own, always staying longer than professional necessity required. Reed, in particular, had become something Marcus could only describe as attentive in that way of a person who has discovered that honesty is available in this space and does not want to leave before they have had enough of it. Reed asked Marcus about his mother. He told them. He told them about a woman who had worked the same land he worked now, who had called him every Sunday without exception, who had made a specific kind of pie for his birthday every year, and had been buried with the recipe written on a card in her coat pocket, because she had intended to teach it to him and had simply run out of time. He told them he did not know the recipe, and never would, and that this was one of the small, specific griefs that caught him sometimes when he was not ready. Sharp and particular, and not at all about pie. Reed made that low sound again. But this time, it did not seem surprised by its own reaction. It made the sound like it meant to. Marcus asked Reed how old it was, in whatever terms made sense. The answer, translated, was approximately 240 years. Marcus received this calmly, as he had received everything about this situation, with the steady openness of someone who had already rearranged his expectations of the world a long time ago. He said that was a long time to be alive. He asked what Reed had lost in that time. Reed took longer to answer than any of them had taken to answer anything. When the response came, it was dense with layers Marcus could not fully untangle. The way a very long and complicated answer arrives in a language you are only partially fluent in. But the shape of it was clear. 240 years was a long time to be alive, and Reed had, in that time, said goodbye to more than Marcus had names for. But it had not called any of those goodbyes brief. It had not given them weight. They had been processed, filed, resolved. The idea that they had weight, that they were still present somewhere inside it as shaped spaces, as absences with outlines, was new. Reed said something that arrived in Marcus's mind like this: "I think I have been carrying things without knowing they had names." Marcus felt his throat tighten. He said yes. He said that was the thing about grief. It did not wait for you to name it. It lived in you before you had words for it. The naming just let you look at it directly. That evening, Vel told Marcus something that none of them had been intending to share. It said that this mission had originally been classified as a routine emotional mapping survey, one of hundreds they had conducted across dozens of species. The data was meant to contribute to a long-term study on pain thresholds and neurological response to loss, useful primarily as comparative biology. The mission had a projected duration of 11 days and a very specific list of things it was meant to produce. It was not meant to produce this. Marcus asked what this was. Vel said it did not have a category for it yet. It said that the entire research team was experiencing something that their science did not have a name for. Not a biological state, not a psychological disruption. Something that had changed the way they understood themselves, quietly and without announcement. The way light changes when a cloud moves and the world looks different without any single thing having moved. Marcus thought about that. He thought about all the ways humans had tried to name that experience and mostly failed, because the names were always smaller than the thing. He thought about sitting in church the week after Daniel's funeral and listening to words that were meant to help and feeling how the words fell short, not because they were wrong, but because the experience was too large for language and always had been. He said to Vel, "I think you are becoming something your instruments were never designed to measure." Vel was quiet for a very long time. Then it said, almost to itself as much as to Marcus, "I think we may have been studying the wrong thing all along. We came to study Paha." On the 11th day, Vel told Marcus the mission was supposed to end. They were sitting in what had become their usual place, the smooth, worn room that Marcus had long since stopped finding strange, the one where the living diagrams on the walls moved slowly in what he had come to think of as a kind of thinking, the way a person drums their fingers when processing something difficult. The not-quite coffee was on the table between them. Outside the small observation panel in the corner, stars moved past with the indifferent beauty of things that have existed far too long to be impressed by anything. Marcus said he had figured. The time was getting close. Vel said the mission report was due to the Oversight Council within 48 hours. It said the report was going to be difficult to write. It said this not with frustration, but with a kind of honest bewilderment, the way a person sounds when they have been asked to summarize an experience that refuses to fit into a summary. Marcus asked what the problem was. Vel said the problem was that the council was expecting a standard pain mapping report, neurological data, emotional response thresholds, comparative analysis with previously studied species, projected applications for their ongoing biological research into consciousness. Vel had approximately 300 pages of that kind of data. The instruments had collected it faithfully in the first 4 days before everyone stopped picking them up. The data was clean and well organized and almost completely beside the point now. Marcus asked what the point was. If Vel had to say it plainly, Vel was quiet for a long moment. Then it said that the point was that they had come here to study a human as a subject, and they were leaving with something closer to a debt. It said this carefully, as if it was not sure the word translated correctly, and Marcus confirmed that it did. Debt, something owed, something received that had not been part of the arrangement, and that now sat in you differently from data the rest of the team had gathered over the past hour without announcement or coordination. The same way people gather when something is ending and they feel it approaching. Reed was there, sitting with the quiet attention it had developed over the past week. The others, whose translated names Marcus had approximated as current, Bridge, Deep Still, First of Morning, and a seventh who had never interacted directly with him, but who had sat in the room every day for the last 5 days and listened, were all present. 8 researchers who had come to map a human suffering and were leaving, every one of them changed in ways they had not consented to and could not undo. Marcus looked at them and felt the familiar weight of an ending. He had a lot of experience with endings. He knew their texture, the way they pressed against the edges of the time before them, making even ordinary moments feel significant because of what was coming after. He had learned not to fight this feeling. It was accurate. Some things were ending. It was right to feel them doing it. He asked whether they would come back. Vel said it hoped so. It said the word with a clarity that told Marcus the concept of hope was one Vel had recently acquired in the personal sense rather than the theoretical one. Their species had hope as a probability assessment, a likelihood calculation. What Vel was expressing now was different. It was the wanting something without being sure of it, the reaching toward an outcome that mattered enough to wish for. Marcus recognized it. He had lived inside it for years. He said he hoped so too. Then he asked the question he had been carrying since the third day, when he had first noticed that the sessions had stopped being research and started being something else. He asked them what they were going to do with what had happened to them. Not the data. The other thing. The room was quiet for a moment. The living diagrams on the walls moved slowly. Bridge, who had not spoken to Marcus directly before, answered first. It said that it intended to think about a particular moment from its past that it had previously categorized and stored. A moment involving a younger member of its research cohort who had not survived their first solo mission, who had been efficient and bright, and who Bridge had worked with for 4 years and never fully acknowledged as someone it cared about until this week. It said it intended to take that moment out of storage and look at it properly. Current said that it had communicated with its bonded partner for the first time in many weeks and had said things it had not previously understood needed to be said. Deep Still said nothing for a while, and then said that it thought it was going to be a different kind of scientist. It did not explain further. It did not need to. Reed looked at Marcus and said, in the careful translated language that had carried so much weight between them over these days, that it had been alive for 240 years, and this was the first time it had ever felt fully met by another consciousness. Not categorized, not studied, met. It said it did not know yet what to do with that, but it knew it was true. Marcus felt that land in his chest. He let it. He was good at letting things land. It was one of the few skills grief had given him that was genuinely useful. He told them that they had met him too. He said that he had come aboard a ship full of alien scientists who wanted to dissect his suffering, which was not exactly the social engagement of the year, and he was leaving having been genuinely known by 8 people, or 8 beings, in a way that most humans went their whole lives without experiencing. He said he was grateful. He said that word carefully, meaning it completely. Vel asked Marcus one final question. It asked whether pain would always be this large for humans, whether this was something specific to him, or something characteristic of the species. Marcus thought about this seriously. He said that pain was this large for every human who had loved something. He said that some people spent their entire lives trying to make themselves smaller so the pain would be more manageable. And some people went the other way and grew around it, made more room for it, let it live alongside everything else instead of trying to put it somewhere dark and quiet. He said he had spent the first years after Daniel trying to make himself smaller, and it had not worked. He was still large enough to hurt. He had stopped fighting that dot, he said. We are a species that loves things we know we are going to lose, and we love them anyway. And we call that living. The room was very still. Then Vel did something Marcus had not seen any of them do before. It stood and crossed the space between them. And it did what might have been the closest physical gesture their physiology could produce to what a human would call a bow. Not the bow of someone lesser to someone greater, but the bow of someone who has received something real and is acknowledging it with their whole body. The rest of the team did the same. All 8 of them, standing and bowing to one tired farmer from Kansas who had walked onto an alien ship because he had nothing left to fear and found that, on the other side of that fearlessness, something extraordinary had been waiting. Marcus stood. He did not bow, because that was not his culture, but he pressed his hand to his chest over his heart, which was his, and he held it there for a moment, and he felt that they understood. The ship set him down in the same cornfield 3 hours later, in the same flattened circle of stalks, under the same Kansas sky. The ship was gone before he had fully processed being outside again. He stood in the dark and breathed. The air smelled like soil and cold and the early suggestion of winter. His knee ached. The farmhouse was a 1/4 mile away, all its lights off, because he had not expected to return tonight. The same dog as before was barking somewhere in the distance. He walked home. His boots on the dirt made their familiar sound, and his knee said what it always said. And the stars above him were the same stars that had always been there. The same ones Daniel had looked at from the same fields as a kid. The same ones his mother had washed dishes under for 40 years. But he knew now. In a way he had not known before he stepped onto that ship. That somewhere up in all that dark, 8 beings who had come to this world to study suffering were sitting with something they had not prepared for, and could not categorize, and would not put down. Were sitting with the shape of things they had lost. Were learning, for the first time in lives far longer than his, what it meant to carry something, not because you had to, but because you chose to. Because the carrying was the last remaining proof that the love had been real. He thought about that as he crossed the last field to his house. He climbed the porch steps and unlocked the door and went inside, and the silence of the house was its usual shape, and he stood in it for a moment and did not try to fill it. He put the kettle on. He sat at the kitchen table. He thought about Daniel, the way he always did at this hour, and for the first time in a very long time, the thinking did not feel like something happening to him. It felt like something he was choosing. A vigil. An honoring. The kettle began to warm. Outside, the Kansas night went on being vast and ordinary, and full of everything that had ever mattered. And Marcus Webb, 43 years old, bad knee, good heart, put his hands around a warm cup and held it the way you hold something you know you are going to have to let go of someday, and love completely in the meantime. Somewhere past the edge of the atmosphere, a ship made of something between biology and engineering moved through the dark between stars, carrying 8 researchers who would never again file a report on pain without.